on this project, and of course with many other projects that he's done with us at NBR in his position as a senior advisor with us, in addition to his daytime role at AEI. It's been a real fun process to learn the ways in which domestic policies in Russia are shaping and, in fact, even altering fundamentally Russia's foreign policy, and we'll hear more about that from Nick. I mentioned the symmetry. In April 2008, we were real pleased to partner with Hudson here for an earlier workshop report that examined some preliminary findings and looked at, Nick gave a presentation, and then we had a series of small roundtables that looked at topics such as the health and education sector investment, national resource development, demographic pressures and implications for public finance infrastructure, and domestic and foreign policy outlooks. And we did that in partnership with Fiona, who was the NIO for Russia and Eurasia at that point. And she and her office lent great support to the initiative then. So there seems to be a real, as I mentioned, symmetry to our coming back here to have the launch and to have Fiona and Enders serve as discussants. We're also very honored to have Dr. Murray Feshbach in attendance today, to whom Nick dedicated this report. And you can see in the early part of the report, the dedication reads, "To a trailblazer who illuminated Russia's demographic terrain in the dark years, unceasingly generous mentor to 2 generations of protégés and students on the occasion of his 80th birthday."
30th birthday. 39.
So we're so pleased you could be here with us today. Of course, with these sorts of efforts, you always are grateful for the sponsors that were wise and generous, and in this case, especially appreciative of the Smith Richardson Foundation and to Pfizer Corporation, which funded some additional research. Well, the way we will proceed today is that Nick will give his presentation, and for those of you who have heard Nick before, it's not really complete unless he has one of his inimitable PowerPoint presentations to go along with it, and so we'll be treated to that. And then Enders will come and offer the first set of discussant comments, and then Fiona will. And then we should have a good amount of time, perhaps as much as 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion. And we look forward to that, and we'll kind of manage that when we get to that point. A couple just housekeeping points. First, we are on the record today, and Enders told me beforehand that we will be video streaming from the Hudson website as soon as it technologically works, perhaps even today, and we'll link to that from the NBR website as well. And for those of you who arrived later and did not get a hard copy of the report, there were limited copies available. Please go to the NBR website. The PDF can be downloaded there for free till the end of this month. And with that, I think that's all I have. Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming here today. I'm so happy to see so many old and new friends here. I wanted to begin by thanking Roy and Enders and Fiona for agreeing to participate. Not only friends, but in a fundamental sense, they've been collaborators in this project as it has gone on. I want to salute Apurva Shah. Apurva Shah, are you here? Apurva Shah, former research assistant, now research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Without his indispensable assistance, this book would doubtless not be ready until the 3rd or perhaps even the 4th Putin presidency. And most of all, I want to salute, of course, Murray Feshbach, who's been the guiding star and the mentor for so many of us in this area and beyond. The argument in my book is that Russia is in the grip of a powerful and fundamentally new sort of demographic crisis that is going to have far-reaching reverberations. It'll take a very long time to work through. Now, population specialists, as you probably know, have a proclivity for calling everything a crisis. Population experts can usually see a cloud around any silver lining. But what we see in Russia today genuinely qualifies, I argue, as a crisis. It is manifestly a big humanitarian crisis. It arguably has significant economic implications, and as we may discuss, this crisis may also have political and security reverberations as well. It's more than your garden variety demographic crisis. It is a far-ranging, interrelated crisis in human resources, which I think makes things more difficult to address. And note, ladies and gentlemen, the title, this is a peacetime crisis. In wars, in times of famine, in times of epidemic, there are demographic shocks and crises. When those wars, when those famines, when those epidemics abate, the demographic crisis abates. Exactly how Russia's peacetime demographic crisis abates is much less clear at this moment. Now let me just run you through a little bit of the homework in this book. This is a set of population pyramids. They're not really pyramids anymore because you don't have enough babies to make them a pyramid. But the translucent one shows Russia's projected population structure 20 years from now, and the dark one shows its structure about 5 years ago. You can see that Russia is slated for a dramatic depopulation over the years immediately ahead. Since the end of the communist era, Russia's population has dropped by about 7 million, or about 5%, proportionately as much as China's population did after the disastrous Maoist experiments in the cultural, the Great Leap Forward. Most of this drop, all of this drop, in fact, has been generated by a surfeit of deaths over births. Births have slumped, deaths have soared since the end of communism. 13 million more deaths than births, 3 deaths for every 2 births in this period as a whole. Migration has to some degree been able to mitigate this population decline, but it obviously has not halted it altogether. There seems to be some sign recently of promising trends towards perhaps a little bit of population stabilization. I'll argue later on that further depopulation may very well be in the Russian future. Let's talk about Russia's birth trends first. In a European context, Russia's steeply sub-replacement birth levels are not unnormal. They are, in fact, completely European, as you can see. Having a birth level 20% or 30% or 35% below the level needed for long-term replacement is a European norm now. There are, in fact, indications that Russia is entering into what some European demographers call the second demographic transition, a time of permanent, more or less permanent sub-replacement fertility, increasingly fragile marital unions, increasing out-of-wedlock birth patterns, and all of the rest of the modernity that we know from Western Europe today. Of course, there are 2 differences that one might point to between the Russian circumstance and the Western European circumstance here. First of all, Russia cannot expect the same sort of generous social welfare benefits for its children of the second demographic transition that can be expected from Western Europe. Secondly, while Western economic theory argues that lower birth rates mean greater investments and thus greater economic opportunities for smaller families, we've seen some very troubling exceptions in Russia today. With the big drop-off in births has also, for example, come a big increase in child abandonment. That's not what Gary Becker would have predicted. The real crisis in this story isn't births, it has to do with deaths. And Russia is the existence proof for the argument that a country with a literate, urbanized population during peacetime can suffer health stagnation and even reversal over the course of 5 decades. In 2008, Russia's overall life expectancy at birth was slightly lower than it had been in 1960. Life expectancy was significantly lower for men than it had been half a century earlier. If I could choose the country I would live in on the basis of mortality trends alone, I would choose a country where trends were low and where the changes from one year to the next were fairly stable, where things were going down in terms of mortality and there weren't big perturbations from one year to the next. If you take a look at what has happened with standardized death rates in Russia since the end of the communist period, they have tended to head up, and they have veered frighteningly, erratically, from one year to the next. At the moment, Russia's overall standardized level of deaths, that's the comparable population structures in comparable countries, apples to apples comparison, is over twice as high as in Western Europe. And perhaps no less astonishing, Russia's level of mortality, age-standardized mortality, is about 50% higher than for the new members of the EU. That is to say, overwhelmingly, the former Soviet bloc members of the EU, who had very similar levels of mortality to Russia just a few years ago. Now, what has been driving Russia's fantastic upsurge in deaths? In a narrow, immediate way, we can describe this by looking at causes of death. The two drivers of Russia's overall upsurge have been deaths attributed to cardiovascular disease, which is to say, to heart attacks, stroke, and the like, and to deaths from so-called external causes, which is to say injuries and poisonings, homicides, suicides, auto accidents, and all the rest of that fun. There's something really strange about Russia's patterns of death from cardiovascular disease today. To quote that great demographer, Captain James Tiberius Kirk of Starfleet Command, Russia has managed to go where no man has gone before. In the West, the highest level of death from cardiovascular disease ever experienced was Finland, 1971. Russia's level of deaths from cardiovascular disease is about 40% higher than Finland's, 1971. And as you can see here, Russia's level of cardiovascular death is about twice as high as would be predicted simply on the basis of the society's income level alone. It is getting much more bang of a cardiovascular sort per buck than would be expected internationally. Things look no less new and unfamiliar when we check Russia's death level from injuries, external causes, poison violence, and all of the rest. Internationally, there is a very tight relationship between income and deaths from these essentially violent causes. They tend to go down with higher incomes. Russia is a complete outlier in the modern world. Russia's level of deaths from these sorts of violent causes is about 5 or 6 times higher than in Western Europe today. In a grim form of gender equality, death rates from these causes for women are higher in Russia than in any Western European state for man. And if you look here on the chart, you'll see that Russia is in a sort of a distinctive club of outliers. The only other countries in the world, in the modern world, that have had such gruesomely high levels of death from injury, external causes, poison, violence, whatever you wish to call it, are Burundi, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Angola, and the Congo. If this country wasn't named and you saw this chart, you would have to presume that Russia was a sub-Saharan conflict or post-conflict society. There is much we still do not understand about this tragedy of excess mortality in Russia. What we do know arithmetically is that excess mortality since the Gorbachev era, and note that we are not setting terribly high standards here if we set the Gorbachev era as the gold standard. Excess mortality since the Gorbachev era has accounted for a cumulative total of 7 million excess deaths in Russia, for the entirety, in other words, of the depopulation that has occurred. If we set a more exacting standard, such as Italy or Greece or France, Russia's excess mortality over the communist era, since the communist era, would be closer to 18 or 20 million persons in the league of the toll from the Great Patriotic War. One of the things we may guess about this health catastrophe is that it may be related to attitudes and outlooks and viewpoints and values, what public health experts might refer to as mental health or depression or stress. In any case, again and again in international surveys, the Russian population represents itself, describes itself as one of the very most unhappy populations in the world. In one of these surveys, Russia came in second only to Zimbabwe. Why the Zimbabweans are the most unhappy people in the world is fairly self-evident. The Russians came in second in this. And the whole role of attitude and outlook, mental health, may explain more than we currently can show about this terrible health catastrophe that Russia is still enduring. I said that Russia's experiencing a crisis in human resources as well. It's not just in health, it's in human resources. One of the most surprising findings to me in my homework in this book was regarding the Russian education system. Russia presents a modern paradox, maybe an almost unique modern paradox. High levels of educational attainment and low levels of human capital. One aspect of this paradox can be seen by looking at educational levels in relation to health. You can't read all of the names of all of these countries on here, so for now you're going to have to take my word for it. But Russian high school graduates have health levels that are lower than the health levels in many Latin American countries with far, far lower levels of educational attainment. It's even worse for men. And by the way, if one looks at the gradations within Russia, the life expectancies for women with college education, high school dropouts, one sees a differential stratification of health that I've witnessed nowhere as extreme in Russia as in South Africa. It's basically South African levels of disparities by educational status within Russia today. Clearly, a high school degree does not confer the same level of health protection in Russia that it does in most of the rest of the world. for whatever reasons. But there's another aspect to the Russian educational crisis, greater educational crisis, and this concerns knowledge production. It isn't happening. One of the measures we can use for looking at knowledge production is to see how much patentable knowledge is being created around the world. I've used here the US Patent Office's numbers on patents being awarded to places around the world. I don't think the US Patent Office is the center of an anti-Russian conspiracy. If it were, we could use the World International Property Office's numbers. They're not appreciably different from these. This chart over here is logarithmic. Each one of these things goes up by a factor of 10. In terms of patents being awarded, Russia is far below the US and Japan. It is far below Germany and some of the other G7 countries. It is below Singapore. It is below Taiwan. You can go through the list. There is only one place in the world I could find that gets awarded about the same number of patents each year as the entire Russian Federation, and that's the state of West Virginia. West Virginia has a somewhat smaller population than the Russian Federation. To put this in a little deeper perspective, perhaps, we can say that there's a relationship between knowledge generation on the one hand and the size of one's university population and the country's per capita income on the other. If you look at things this way, you see that there's a very strong relationship internationally. With every doubling of per capita income, the amount of knowledge generation, the number of patents created per million university grads, quadruples. It's an increasing return to scale of the sort that economists like Paul Romer and others have talked about over time. That's another discussion. What is pertinent here is to see how Russia compares to the rest of the world. Russia is punching way below its weight. This is a logarithmic scale, ladies and gents. Given the country's income level, given the country's huge number of university graduates, Russia should be producing at least 3 times as much patentable knowledge today as it is. The Russian education system today is analogous to the old Soviet factory. Enormous amounts of resources coming in, not so much going out. So what about the future? At the moment, not only the Census Bureau and the United Nations Population Division, but even Goskomstat medium variant projections anticipate, project that Russia's population will continue to decline over the years immediately ahead. And those projections are based on the projection that deaths will continue to exceed births more or less for as long as the demographer's eye can see, and that compensating immigration won't account for all of this natural imbalance. We can talk about this more later. I mean, this gets into some very technical things that I'm just skating over right now. The projection, and at this point, the almost irreversible reality, is that Russia's working age labor force is set to decline steeply over the next 2 decades. We can say that because almost everybody who will be in Russia's 15 to 64 group is already alive today, already in the country today, barring some radical reconfiguration of borders or migration patterns through the world. Western Europe on this chart is green, Russia's red. This is showing the prospective change by age group between 2005, just a few years ago, and 2030, in the size of different workforce cohorts. We've all heard about Western Europe's stagnation or depopulation, some would call it. Look how much steeper the drop-off is for Russia in the critical, key, younger workforce areas. And notice, by the way, that Russia's prospective growth in older population is proportionately not that much different from Western Europe's. In all of the modern world, urban centers are the centers of economic growth. They're the engines of global economic activity. Russia's urban centers, unlike almost any other countries in recent histories, has been declining in size. Russia's urban population has been shrinking over the last 20 years. And although these projections are problematic, the United Nations, for obvious reasons, the United Nations Population Division projects that urban Russia will continue to shrink in size over the next 2 decades. It's not just that urban Russia is getting smaller. Urban Russia is sick by comparison not only to Western societies, but also to the other BRIC countries with which Russia is sometimes likened. Brazil, Russia, India, China, the BRICS, right? Urban Russia's life expectancy is far below urban China's. Urban Russia's life expectancy is far below urban Brazil's. And you may not have guessed this, but urban Russia's life expectancy is also below urban India's, despite India's manifest and also extensive urban poverty. Indeed, if we were just to look at life expectancy at age 15 for the country as a whole, Russia's life expectancy today would not only be lower by this metric than China's or than Brazil's, it would also be lower than India's. Russia faces considerable challenges in trying to generate economic growth from a declining workforce, which is also a debilitated one. I'm going to skip this discussion of ethnic composition right now and the movement of people out of the Russian Far East. I suspect that both Anders and Fiona may have some things to say about this of their own. But just to point out that the outlook for young military manpower in Russia is not terribly favorable over the next several decades. And we know this because the soldiers of the future, at least for the next 18 years or so, are already alive today. The outlook is for an enormously constrained pool of military recruits for the Kremlin in the years immediately ahead. So it's labor force shrinkage, debilitation of labor force, constraints on military manpower. What have I forgotten? Oh yes. Did I remind you that there are going to be a lot more old people in Russia in the future than there are today, with a smaller labor population to support them? Russia is going to be an aging society while all of this is going on, and that is going to make for an even greater economic burden than the country would otherwise face. Leadership in the Kremlin has addressed to some degree some of these problems. We can talk about how successfully their remedies may prove to be in our discussion period, but it seems that Kremlin leadership, ambitious as it is, hasn't even begun to recognize the scope of some of the problems which we discuss in this book. For the future well-being of the Russian population, I very much hope that their attention does turn to some of these protracted long-term issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Now we turn to Anders Wimbush, Senior Vice President, Hudson Institute, our host and discussant.
Thanks, Roy, and thanks to Nick for that stirring but depressing discussion. I have had the great fortune of being able to look over Nick's shoulder for the last couple of decades as he has dug into much of this, and it has truly been enlightening. But I, like so many others here, first became aware of these lethal demographic conditions in Russia back in the 1970s, and I got those, of course, from the great Murray Feshbach, when he was one of the few people, almost the only person, rooting beneath the hood of Soviet ministries and institutes who were trying to collect some data in strange and unusual forms, and then making something out of that, which Murray set us all on the path to where we are today. It seems to me that in Nick's analysis that there's really a very simple and actually quite frightening bottom line, and that is this: there's no going back. There's no going back. Russia, if I read this book correctly, is very unlikely to be saved, and probably not likely to save itself from a future that will deplete its human capital to such an extent that Russia may cease to be a competitive state and perhaps even a viable one. And that the Russian society that we have known and that they have known will accelerate towards some new composition that we cannot now imagine. As Nick reminds us late in the book, on page 286, in modern Russia, the abnormal has become the new norm. And Russia's conditions aren't normal, as he makes absolutely clear. And the pathway of its human security crisis is likely to be unpredictable, and it's almost certain to be strewn with miscalculations. Prediction and forecasting is always fraught with uncertainty, and while demography is one of those things that we can know with some confidence, that is, we can know what Russia's condition will be, the way people choose to behave as this condition's effect tighten are mostly unknowable in advance. I'm someone who spends much of his time looking at how actors imagine the future, how they set their objectives for getting into the future, and how they design strategies that will help them meet those objectives. And for the last couple of weeks after going through this book again, I have been trying to imagine to myself both the strategies, or some strategies, that the Russians themselves will entertain in the knowledge of this very precarious demographic condition, and those strategies that may occur to outside actors looking in at this changing Russia, which is inexorably unraveling before their eyes. So let me share a few of those thoughts with you. First, let me explore a couple of the internal strategies that one might imagine. And the first is that for many Russians, especially the better educated and more professionally mobile, to leave Russia for better opportunities elsewhere is going to be a very powerful incentive. This will, of course, deepen most of the demographic pathologies that Nick has already described. For why would you stay when it becomes increasingly evident that Russia's deteriorating human capital makes it increasingly difficult to create more and better opportunities and sustain them into the future? Why would you stay? This isn't an abstract calculation when all around you education is declining, industries can't innovate, health is deteriorating, and, as Nick described, most people are becoming more and more unhappy. This strikes me as an absolute no-brainer. Those who can go will find the disincentive to stay very powerful, and this will make whatever incentives to go, no matter how distant, seem much more attractive. A rich history of outmigrations of this kind is available for comparison, and I would be particularly interested to know how closely the Russians themselves are studying this history and what conclusions they have reached. Second, lots of actors in Russia, both Russians and non-Russians, will seek to change the structure of power in the Russian state as the Russians lose their demographic dominance. We're already seeing jockeying for position in places like Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Kaliningrad, the Urals, Siberia, and the Russian Far East for greater influence in those regions. Challenges of this kind to Russian and Moscow's influence are likely to be highly infectious. Could Russia, in the grips of this demographic catastrophe, descend into the abyss of multiple ethnic and regional departures from national authority, with power being reallocated locally and regionally and realigned with the anxieties stimulated by the new demographic realities? The interesting question will become, from my standpoint, at what point does Russian dominance of the state become so compromised that any attempt to revive it will trigger even more aggressive fracturing? Moderate Russian nationalist Fyodor Krushenikov, just a couple of days ago, gave a prescient warning. He said he noted that change in Russia from decade to decade had been truly radical. It was not following the pattern of what he called stable states, where change from decade to decade is usually incremental and on the margins. And in 2030, he forecasts, and I quote, that Russia may not exist at all, at any rate, not in its current borders and form. Third, the consequences of demographic decline for foreign and security policy are certain to be powerful. Russia will cease to have large armies to throw at its adversaries, a greater reluctance to take the kinds of casualties caused by war, and if the scenario that I just sketched is correct, a much more difficult time assembling a political consensus to do so. Russia long ago ceased to be a global actor, a global power. In the demographic meltdown scenario that Nick has presented for us, it's even hard for me to imagine that Russia will be a particularly coercive regional actor of consequence. This is certainly one of the military lessons from August of 2008. Nonetheless, I think we should expect to see a demographically weakened Russia choosing its competitive engagements selectively and engaging actively in competitive strategies that encourage Russia's adversaries to act in ways that ultimately benefit Russia's interests. Coincidentally, Russian strategies will seek to stimulate other players to act as Russian proxies, and a clever Russia will explore ways to raise its adversaries' costs short of war without adding much to Russia's own bill. And we can be reasonably confident that Russia's leaders, to the extent possible and allowed by the deterioration of their human capital, will seek to substitute technology for human power in its defense and military planning. Russia will, of course, remain a nuclear power as it declines, and I can't add much to the way Nick has treated this in the book, and that there will be many incentives in Russia's strategic thinking to think nuclear. But as nuclear weapons emerge of necessity as Russia's primary instrument of influence, we should expect to see Russia engaging actively in nuclear coercion, intimidation, and denial. Moreover, in my view, we shouldn't be surprised if Russia becomes a more active participant in the nuclear marketplace, if only to distribute its available influence to other actors in ways that shift balances elsewhere that serve Russian interests and raise its adversaries' costs. Fourth, Russia's dwindling ability to sustain human capital required of a modern economy will force it to seek partners whose cooperation and investment will delay or disguise its own lack of momentum. I would argue that this search is already going on, with a number of important economic actors being courted heavily by Moscow. These include primarily Germany, but France and Turkey also, and the United States out on the far margins. And of these, Germany seems to me to be the most ardent suitor, raising the very interesting specter of a longer-term Germany-Russia realignment whose implications will be felt across the globe. What was once fanciful is now at least thinkable, that Germany's new Eastern strategy will converge with Russia's increasingly desperate survival strategy to fundamentally alter the geostrategic shape of Eurasia. The European Union, as we know it, is already under intense strain and may not survive, at least in my view. If Russia comes to figure even more prominently in Germany's economic and geopolitical sense of its own future, will this not put even more pressure on fragile Europe? And in this sense, if we want to take a very big leap, would it be totally imprudent to ask if Russia's demographic crisis could indirectly foreshadow the weakening of Europe? Finally, I'd go way out on a limb here. What kinds of strategies can we imagine Russia and Russians adopting to answer the most fundamental of all questions? Who are we? Who are we? One can imagine eschatological narratives erupting across the Russian space, seeking to explain and perhaps even to justify Russia's steady demographic eradication from the human family. This is a movie by Steven Spielberg, or perhaps by Stephen King. What lurks in the heart of a proud nation that knows it's pointed toward extinction? What kind of ideologies emerge? And what kinds of political strategies attach to them? How do Russians address the acute identity crisis that's certain to attend their dwindling capacity to imagine a positive national future? Let me turn very briefly to the external strategies. How might others be looking in on Russia and thinking about this demographic crisis? The most obvious, of course, and the most discussed, is the potential loss of largely uninhabited portions of Russia's vast territories to other acquisitive powers. This isn't a new idea. You're hearing nothing new here, as most of you know. It's been widely discussed in Russia, and certainly by Western analysts for years. How does Russia hang on to Siberia and the Far East as the stock of local Russians declines precipitously on its side of the border, while millions of Chinese are drawn into these territories through a kind of osmosis in search of economic opportunity, land, or to escape the growing impact of China's own fault lines? Considerable evidence and heightened Russian concern indicate that this is no idle possibility. A second area of concern for Russia will be the perception by outsiders that Russia's changing demographic balance could make groups inside Russia more willing to take risks to advance particular agendas. For example, radical Islamists beyond Russia may be emboldened to reach out more directly to Russia's Muslims because they may calculate Russia's Muslims will be less fearful of a dwindling Russian majority. Thus might outside influences grow in Russia precisely because the demographic balance is changing. The other side of this coin, of course, is the possibility that such interference will cause a strident backlash from Russians feeling threatened from forces abroad seeking to create a fifth column among them. Thus might demographic change endanger Russia's political stability via external rather than internal stimuli. Third, Russia lacks the human capital to project its military power beyond the former Soviet space, but it still maintains a robust nuclear capability, and this will cause it to be viewed, I think, as a very special kind of niche strategic actor. in this sense, Russia will be seen more as a balance changer, a balance shifter, but not as the natural leader or even as the decisive member of strategic alliances and relationships. Thus, the reality of Russia's demographic meltdown will likely to serve to deepen Russian resentment that it's not being treated with the respect it deserves in global corridors of power, for indeed it's doubtful that Russia will be able to command it. But evidence of such a lack of respect will come not just from the global powerhouses like the United States and increasingly China, but from less powerful actors like Turkey and Iran, and those who seek Russia's reduced weight for their own reasons, to enhance their own growing influence. So in this way, Russia's demographic challenges could bear directly on the kinds of alliances and relationships it will be able to negotiate, as well as its role within those relationships. This is just a sample of the kinds of strategic reconsiderations that might be stimulated by Russia's demographic crisis. But how would we know to what extent demographic decline is responsible for any of these things, and to what extent is it causal or just contributory, and when and how can it be seen as a trigger for action? There are just too many gaps in our knowledge about how demography figures in strategy, or at least in the design of strategy. Surely we can find some guidance in history about how to think about this question, or perhaps it's in psychology or neuroscience. What's certain is this, that the dilemmas of Russia's demography, as Nick has described them so ably, are huge and mostly unprecedented. We would be foolish to think that they will go unnoticed either amongst Russians who think seriously about their individual and corporate future, and who will be designing hedging strategies to compensate for this encroaching demographic weakness, or among outsiders looking in who will attempt to understand Russia's demographic catastrophe and incorporate that understanding into its emerging consequences into their strategies for supporting their own interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enders. Now we turn to Fiona Hill, Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution, and as I mentioned earlier, previously the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. Fiona.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, I'm coming at the end of a rather grim overview here, and I'm glad I ate my sandwich already, because otherwise I'd be quite put off, I think, by my lunch here. I'm actually going to try to pick up on some of the issues that Enders raised here, because there's considerable food for thought in which is already, I can see on the floor here, a very weighty tome of Nick's work. And for those of you who haven't read it, it actually is a very easy read too, so don't be put off by the volume, because it's amply illustrated with all the wonderful charts and things that you've seen here. But it really is a monumental piece of work that Nick has undertaken here, and really builds up on the great legacy of Professor Feshbach. And I think you have a worthy heir in many respects here to the great work that you've pioneered here, Professor Feshbach, and it's a great honor and pleasure to see you here. One of the issues that I wanted to contemplate for a while is really the Russian government's stress here on modernization. Over the last year, we've had a great deal of talk about modernization at all levels of the Russian government. This has become the buzzword of the moment in Moscow. But it's a really serious issue that the Russian government is thinking about. And many of the considerations about modernization are driven by just the realization about the trends that Nick is outlining. I mean, much of the information that you saw on those charts is actually from Russian sources, as Nick would be the first to tell you. So it's not that the Russians haven't been compiling this data and thinking about it. In some of the earlier meetings that Nick had in support of this research included a number of really quite prominent Russian scholars who have fully appraised and realized the impact of the trends. So many of the things that we see talked about today in Russia, including military reform and the push for rearmament, are very much picking up on the demographic consequences and the strategic consequences that Enders was highlighting. Also, much of the discussion about public health and the education system comes from the same set of information. And then on top of that, of course, there's a great deal of concern about dealing with decaying infrastructure and also the diversification of the economy away from the heavy reliance on energy and the commodities sectors. Now, those are the two of the areas that actually might be most difficult to tackle, precisely because of the problems that Nick has outlined. Because if you have a declining labour force and you're trying to diversify away from commodities and the energy sector, you actually need a larger, more qualified labour force than you actually do for energy and commodities. Only 2% of the Russian labour force is employed in that broader energy and commodities sector. So 98% of the labour force is another sector. So diversification, which is one of the buzzwords for the Russian government, actually becomes more difficult if you don't have the labour force to actually carry that out. And also that's the same case in infrastructure. Infrastructure projects require a lot of bodies of people to actually develop, build the roads and construct the bridges, you name it. And there's, of course, we've seen for all of us who have travelled to Russia over recent times that most of that work has been done by Tajiks and other migrant workers who have been coming in. And of course, that's the great hallmark of success in the Chinese economy, is that China still has, for now, until its own demographic profile changes in the near future, a large number of people that can be deployed for large-scale infrastructure projects. So those are just some of the things to think about. So when you look at the issue of the modernization program that the Russian government is launching, there are all kinds of implications here from the demographic crisis that really cloud the outlook for Russia. So when we think forward from 2010, looking out over the next decade, Russia may be facing even more of a paradox than Nick is outlining, because the chances for Russia, at least the Russian state, the Russian government, remaining wealthy from energy revenues is still quite high. So the paradox of Russia remaining a wealthy state with increasing per capita incomes, but still facing the severe consequences of this decades-long decay are going to be really acute. And that raises questions about the forthcoming 2012 Russian presidential election, which there were a number of quips about here. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation about what will happen in 2012. But one thing to bear in mind is that the 2008 election that produced the tandem that many of us keep talking about, with this rather unique, historically unique and unprecedented structure of executive power, with the division of labor and authority between Putin and Medvedev, which is Russia's labor force at work. They both have very different tasks, clearly, from this division. That was carried out against a backdrop not just of soaring oil prices and economic growth, but against a backdrop of a sense that things were going really well for Russia. Now the case is very different, because no matter who retains the presidency after 2012, we'll have to deal with not just the impact of the economic downturn and the financial crisis, which really hit after 2008, but also all of these critical near and long-term challenges that Nick and Anders have outlined. We saw last year, for example, a huge explosion at a giant Siberian hydroelectric power. This year we've been, appalled, I would say all of us have been, by the dreadful fires that have consumed a greater part of western part of Russia than ever before, and the mortality implications of this, but the impact that this has had on the decayed infrastructure and all of the capacity for dealing with these problems, really highlighting a lot of the problems in emergency services and, in fact, in the organizational capacity of the government to respond to these calamities. But this really shows that from now on, things are going to be a lot more difficult than they have been over the last decade. And also, as Nick's study makes very clear, if one can use this analogy of chickens coming home to roost, I'm not sure if we have demographic chickens, but in any case, all of those chickens, as Nick makes very clear in the report, come home right now in 2010. If you look at most of your charts, there's a rather unfortunate drop-off after the date of 2010 on pretty much every indices that you have been pointing to. And at one of our meetings that we had last year, I overheard one of the Russian participants soberly remarking to another of his colleagues in Russia, I'm glad I'm not going to be president in 2012. Basically, because of the fact that whoever is president in 2012 is going to have to come to terms with the fact that they're going to be dealing with a lot less than they had before in many respects, and a lot more in terms of challenges. Now, we already had some discussion with Enders here about some of the larger implications of the decline on a geopolitical, and I would put this on the domestic geopolitical level as well as externally, and I'd like to talk about that just a little, if I may. I think what's most significant in the volume is how it makes crystal clear that the decline has not been uniform, that we're not talking about a rapid decline across all of Russian territory. And although pretty much all of Russian regions in the Urals, Siberia, and the Far East, and even in the northwest around St. Petersburg, have suffered from significant population decline, there have been two regions where the population has increased. And Nick, you did talk about that, and it's a combination of migration and some increases in birth rates, which you highlighted but are very clear in the report, and that's Moscow and southern Russia. And Nick talked about the urban population in Russia being in decline, but of course it's up in Moscow. This is a concentration in one increasingly fragile urban area of all of the pressures of urban life, where everywhere else declines. Moscow is the place that everybody wants to be. And you also show in your work some interesting differences then in health and other life expectancy outcomes between Moscow and everywhere else. But as we've seen from the recent forest fires, the smog and all of the other problems in Moscow, when you have more population concentrated in that area, and you have all of the infrastructure dilemmas that Moscow is facing, there's only a certain point that Moscow can keep expanding to. So that again, there's going to be a lot of discussion in the future about how you can keep accommodating millions and millions more people, literally, in Moscow. Because I think it's been an increase of about 3 million people over the last decade or so. Now, the other point is, in spite of Ender's rather dramatic invocation of Steven Spielberg or Stephen King, Russians aren't simply going to just disappear entirely one day. I mean, I think perhaps there is a point when one plays out lower than replacement level birth rates. I don't know how long it takes, Nick, if you could actually end up with a tiny population. But in any case, Russians are going to be around with us for rather a long time to come. And certainly for the next 2 decades, Russia is still going to be a significant player on the international stage. But it's one with a very different geopolitical profile than ever before in its history. So if we think out to 2020 and to 2030, what we're going to see, in addition to a population concentrated in Moscow, is also a population concentrated in the southern federal district. That's the broad area, including Stavropol, Krasnodar, and the North Caucasus Republic, and also Sochi, the famous southern resort. So that actually creates a Russia that's actually more of a Black Sea regional power than it has ever been before in its history, and one that is most definitively west of the Urals. So we're really talking about a European and Southern European Russia here, which is something that we haven't, it was the dream of Catherine the Great, but it wasn't something that we were contemplating for several hundred years. But it also is a Russia that looks increasingly empty once one gets east of Moscow, and you're going to be looking at a string of isolated and, as Nick pointed out, increasingly smaller, dwindling cities surrounded by vast empty hinterlands all the way out across the Urals to China and the Pacific. So this means a Russia that's extremely sensitive in two key areas. The south, which is pretty unstable for Russia. We've talked a lot in different fora around town about the problems in the North Caucasus. And then in the east, which Anders touched upon. And the North Caucasus, this is Russia's poorest and most unstable region. And the birth rates there, as Nick points out in the report, have been much higher than anywhere else in Russian regions, especially in Chechnya. Now, this also is relative, of course. These are not vast differences in fertility, as Nick's very careful to point out. But given the problems in the North Caucasus, where there's an active insurgency, you have extremely high unemployment, and increasing difficulties of the federal government in governing the area, this seems much more likely to stoke further problems of the nature that we've seen over the last 2 decades of nationalist and religious extremism, and the difficulties of creating political structures to deal with this. Some analysts of the region have started to refer to the North Caucasus as Russia's FATA, the federally administered tribal areas. I mean, this is clearly not as bad as the northwest frontier and other provinces in Pakistan, but it clearly illustrates some of the dimensions of the problems that Russia is dealing with there. Moving on to the far east of Russia, which Nick, Skip, and Anders already touched upon, I think we should pay considerable attention to what this really means for Russia's relations with China. And Russia, in Russia previously, particularly up until 2008, there was really a feeling that Russian-Chinese relations had been at a high point. And I think as we look forward after 2010, that this is changing really quite dramatically as a result of the demographic disparities that Nick points out, but also a number of economic and additional trends that track in China's rather than Russia's favour. Now, Anders touched upon this somewhat, but I think it's actually an interesting area to think about. And of course, at Hudson and other think tanks, a lot of discussions in the last decade about the possibility of a Chinese-Russian convergence, a strategic partnership. And I think this is extremely unlikely when one looks at the trends that Nick has described and you look out over the next decade. In fact, many of the patterns of divergence may soon come to overcome the patterns of convergence that we saw between Russia and China. And it's not just because China has recovered more quickly from the effects of the economic crisis, but it's also the fact that China-Russia relationship has been very much dependent on commodities. You can see now in Russian analytical articles over the last 2 years, much more of a concern about becoming a raw materials appendage of China, far more so than of Europe in the past. Concerns in Russian military circles that as they export arms to China, the Chinese are basically reversing engineering these and building up their own military complex and are beginning to even push Russia out of some arms markets. And then there's concerns that the future build-up of the Chinese army, particularly if Taiwan is resolved as a focal point for China, may lead China to flex its muscles once again in that Pacific region in Northeast Asia against Russia's own interests. And Russia paid close attention to the fact that China did not recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia back in 2008. And of course the fact that China is increasing its economic footprint quite dramatically in Central Asia, right in Russia's own backyard. Now, energy is still the main driver in Russia's calculations about China. We're still going to see a lot of Russian attention paid to relations with China. But I think what we're starting to see is these apprehensions over demography really coming to the fore. And if you look at recent incidents in Russia, particularly over the last year, you've seen periodic outbreaks of xenophobia, many attacks against Chinese workers, not just in the Far East, but actually closer to Moscow, periodic closing downs of Chinese markets where most Chinese goods and migrant workers have been. And although the Russian government has managed to tamp this out, and most of the rhetoric of the Russian government is still quite effusive about the relationship with China, it's very different when one moves out to the Far East and into Siberia about the commentary. Nick pointed out that the population of the Far East in his volume is 6.5 million across an area which is 1/3 of Russia's territory, and I think you put it very starkly here in the book. Whereas just across the border of the Amur River in the Far East in Heilongjiang province, you have a population there of 38.1 million, which when I looked that up has gone up by about 2 million people since 2000. So as the Russian population has declined by the same proportion, the population across the river has increased. What we're starting to see now is a return to all of the talk about the reindustrialization of Siberia and the Russian Far East that many of us had thought had gone or faded from the pages of Russian plans. Cliff Gaddy and I at Brookings, picking up on a lot of work that Nick and Professor Feshbach and many others had done, wrote a book back in 2003 about the Siberian Curse, the plans in the 70s to industrialize Siberia and what impact that had actually had on the demographic levels. What we're seeing is all of those plans being dusted off and elaborated again since 2008. You're seeing huge construction projects in the Russian Far East. Russia's going to be hosting the APEC summit in 2012 and is building grandiose bridges, and this isn't another takeoff of, unfortunately, the late Senator Stevens' bridge to nowhere. This is a bridge to somewhere, going to an island off Vladivostok, but in fact they've had some real construction problems we can talk about later. But there's billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars being pumped into building up this island off Vladivostok in the hope that Russia will be able to attract more population, not just more economic investment to the region. Russian railroads and Gazprom are involved in large-scale gasification and railroad construction projects, all trying to tie Siberia and the Russian Far East back to the European core again. And there's even been an idea floated by a couple of Russian political parties to move the Russian capital. So I guess as smog starts to engulf Moscow, maybe that's going to become a more popular idea. And there are a couple of ideas of building a new capital from scratch in southern Siberia, perhaps close to the Kazakh capital of Astana, maybe just across the border there. That's also in southern Siberia. Or moving it to Tobolsk, which is actually an old Tsarist era idea. But the whole purpose of this plan is to rebalance the country demographically as well as economically. This is really. This would also involve large-scale movement of population out into Siberia. Now, none of this looks particularly likely, but in any case, it's worth noting that all of these issues are back on the table again because they suggest that there's been a real radical rethinking of the situation here. Now, one thing that I do want to note, Enders talked about the strategy of Russians leaving, and where most Russians are leaving to is, of course, Europe. And just as Russia seems more anxious in the east, there is a very different situation developing in the west. And I think there's another book for Nick in here. I'm sure he doesn't really want to start another project, given the fact he's just finished this one. But I actually think that there may be a very interesting next volume, Nick, that picks up on one of the ideas that Enders had raised here. When you look at the history of other migrations from Russia, Russians actually have tended to mostly stay in place. But there have, of course, been some waves of migration, 1860s and 1880s, which was when there were great problems in the peasant agricultural economy. And that was, of course, all the way across Europe, so most of the migrations have brought people to the United States. And then again, of course, after the revolution. But for the most part, Russia has not been a net I'm not sure I say it's not a contributor of migration. It's actually been a recipient of migration. And certainly over the last several decades, Russia has been one of the largest recipient countries of migration. But this is really changing as well. And especially since the 1990s, you've seen a rather large displacement of Russians to European countries. It's not just the Baltic states and the indigenous populations, as one might call them now at least, of Russians who, of course, migrated there in the Soviet period, but the UK, Germany, the Czech Republic, Finland, I could go on down the list, have literally hundreds of thousands of new Russians in terms of new immigrants from Russia living there. Russians have become a real feature in most European economies. They're seeking higher education there. Many people are living there on a pretty much permanent basis. It's not just a case of studying or vacationing there. The euro, in spite of the problems of the eurozone right now, has become a second currency inside Russia, even displacing the dollar in many transactions. And one of the issues that raises there is what happens with all of these Russians moving abroad. Of course, the big implications that Anders was talking about here. But it might be interesting to contemplate about what the trends are among Russians living abroad. I see in many respects that there could be the development of a hybrid Russia here. Are the health indices and different mortality and fertility rates there among Russians living in Europe than in Russia itself? Certainly there's been a couple of studies in the Middle East of Russian women marrying, this one was done actually in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, of Russian women marrying Palestinian men and having much more children than they would with Russian men back home in Russia. Alcohol was actually seen as one of the phenomenon there because Palestinian men tend to drink a lot less than Russian men. And in some of the studies that Nick cited in the past, we'd seen a lot of now mixed marriages in Russia with migrant workers, women marrying Tajiks and others who drink a lot less or don't drink at all in preference over Russian spouses. And one of the questions might be that if Russians change many of the attitudes and patterns that Nick was describing in the book once they move into Europe. And does that have any impact on Russians back home? I mean, it would be really interesting to ask a lot of questions. And when I was at the National Intelligence Council, I started to speculate about this after the war in Georgia in 2008, because when the Russians invoked the idea that they had the right to intervene in basically to protect Russian populations no matter where they were, one of my British colleagues quipped, "Oh God, are they going to basically intervene and invade London because there are more Russians living around Green Park than there are in Skin Valley?" So there was a lot of questions in a jovial manner that were raised here, but actually it made, for me in any case, some sort of serious thought. How many Russians actually live in Europe now? We have all kinds of figures. I actually tried to find that out from the EU. You can get them on a different country-to-country basis, but you might have to extrapolate in a larger area between the EU 27 and then broader European non-EU countries. How long are they living there? Are they just there for study? Are they just there for work? Is this, or is this more permanent? Is it second residency, or is this essentially their permanent residency? What are their income and education rates? Are they all the middle class, or the elite, or just the oligarchs? I think we'll find them at different levels. What's their family and fertility patterns? Are they having more children? Are the marriages more stable? These kinds of questions. And then what's the health and life expectancy profiles here? So here, Nick, I'm giving you your next set of questions here. And then, so what are the implications for Russia over the next couple of decades? Do we get two Russias? Do we have the Russians in Europe and then the Russians at home? So I think this is a lot of questions here that Nick has done such a great study that certainly if all of us had a mind to it, we could probably produce another 10 or 20 just to continue with all of the issues and implications here. But in any case, Nick, thank you so much for a really fantastic piece of work, and over to you for the next volume.
The sequel.
We have about 35 minutes, and thanks to Nick for his just gripping treatment of the key findings in the report, and then to Anders and Fiona for their very stimulating comments. I'm sure that has led to a number of questions and or comments that folks want to make. If you just raise your hand, and sir in the back, the light blue shirt, I don't know if there is a mic. Just wait for the mic, and if you would, identify yourself and make your point.
Thank you. Mark Plattner from Journal of Democracy. Fascinating presentation, Nick. I'm just wondering to what extent what you're describing is a Russian phenomenon or a post-Soviet phenomenon, and in particular, to what extent these same kind of trends can be observed in other post-Soviet countries, particularly Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and so on. Thank you.
Let's actually group three questions together in the hope that we'll get even more opportunity to hear responses from Nick. Sir, yes.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. Would you comment a bit on many of the claims that have been coming out of the Russian Ministry of Health and other political levels to the effect that Russia has turned its demographic problem around? You said that you were going to do that, but you never got around to it.
And then one more right here on the right.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an intelligence analyst. Belarus and Ukraine are having very similar problems. And the one thing they share is serious amounts of drinking. And drinking contributes to the heart disease, to the accidents, to all those things that you mentioned. In a way, that can be viewed as the sort of Clausewitzian center of gravity of this problem. It's the one thing that you can nuke to turn this thing around. There is, of course, as Fiona mentioned, a group of folks who don't drink as much, and that's the Muslims. And there are some who suggest that we'll see a Muslim Russia by 2050. We already have 24% of the recruits in the Russian military coming from Muslim populations. So does the West have an interest in attacking alcoholism in Russia? Does the West have an interest in strengthening Russia rather than letting it diminish? Does the West have an interest in inviting Russia into NATO to help strengthen it?
Nick, you first, and then Fiona and Anders might have comments.
Can I get this thing back on here? No, we don't need it. Let me try to address all of those questions together, since they do have somewhat overlapping issues there. Belarus and Ukraine, and to some extent Moldova, echo some of the demographic shocks that we've seen in the Russian Federation. Big drops in fertility, setbacks in life expectancy and the rest. But no country from the former Soviet Empire has felt such extreme health shocks as Russia has. The nature is similar, but the Richter scale reading is much higher in Russia than anywhere else. And even more notably, we should point out that there have been turnarounds in the health problem in a number of post-Soviet or post-Warsaw Pact areas. And Russia is still, as I said, slightly below where it was almost 50 years ago in terms of overall life expectancy. The Baltics have turned around. The Baltics are healthier than they've ever been before. Here's one for us that should make us worry as Americans. East Germany, the former GDR, now has a higher life expectancy than the USA. There is life and there is health after Soviet rule. They just haven't had so much of that in Russian Federation itself. Now, with respect to the demographic initiatives and the demographic claims of the Russian government, it is of course true that the Kremlin has implemented an ambitious program for increasing birth rates, a pronatalist baby bribe or baby bonus program, whatever one wants to call it. It's also true that belatedly, I mean, better late than never, the Kremlin has been addressing health problems in Russia, including, as was mentioned in particular, Russia's deadly romance with the vodka bottle, which has a long and fabled history. And there are many in the Russian government who are claiming that the situation has turned around. That in the year 2009, for example, for the first time in 15 years, the total Russian population didn't decline, that with gradual increases in births and decreases in deaths, Russia's population may stabilize as planning documents have decreed already, and may even turn up. And that's all well and good to hear. But if you read through the documents themselves for Russia's official demographic future, they look as if they were written by King Canute. I mean, it's, there are only so many things that you can command. And one of the things that you can't command are future cohort sizes of childbearing age women. Over the next 10 or 15 years, given the birth slump that occurred after the end of communism, there will be many fewer women in these prime childbearing ages. All other things being equal, this will lead to immense pressures for fewer, not more births for Russia in the years immediately ahead. By the same token, one cannot command people to be healthy, cheering though it would be to be able to do so. There is an enormous amount of negative health momentum in the Russian population structure. Death rates for today's 50-year-olds are higher than they were for 50-year-olds 30 years ago. Death rates for 40-year-olds are higher than they were for death rates for 40-year-olds 30 years ago. Death rates for 30-year-olds are higher than they were for 30-year-olds 30 years ago. You're getting the picture here, right? What this means is that even getting back to dad's survival prospect would constitute an immense improvement in health conditions for Russia today. And if we could get back to dad's health prospects, life expectancy at age 15 in Russia would be lower for men than for their counterparts in Pakistan or Bangladesh or India. Because remember, the rest of the world hasn't been standing still while Russia's health situation has been turbocharged in reverse. It is certainly true that life expectancy seems to be highest within Russia in some of its southern areas, in Chechnya, in Dagestan, and the like. I haven't done enough homework to look at these numbers in great detail. After the 2010 population census, which was off again, on again, off again, and now I take it is actually going to be conducted, we may have a bit more information about this, be able to tell more about the mortality differences within Russia and some of their correlates. But I argue in this book that we have an interest in a healthy, not a dying Russia. This interest is first and foremost a humanitarian interest, because I think we have transcendent humanitarian values. But there are other reasons to imagine that a healthy Russia could be good for the world, could be much better for the world than the Russia we currently have to interact with. Not the least of these reasons is that a healthy Russia is likely to be a more prosperous Russia. And a prosperous Russia will bring wealth to the rest of the world, not just to Russians. By the way, one last thing. We have a lot of talk in the Kremlin and elsewhere about how Russia might be a future natural resource superpower on the basis of its mineral wealth. There are no natural resource superpowers. There never have been natural resource superpowers. Spain tried it a little bit with stolen gold for a while. It didn't work so well. It works even more problematically today. Just one statistic for everyone to consider. Russia, for all its oil wealth, energy wealth, mineral wealth, has never, not once, exceeded Belgium in annual export revenues. There's only so far you can rise on the hopes of natural resources.
Fiona, Enders, any comment on the implications for the U.S.?
Well, I'll let Fiona do that because she's been a real diplomat. But I do want to pick up on the alcohol question just with three quick observations. One, stopping it has been tried a number of different times to extraordinary failure every time it's been tried. In the 1980s, after one such anti-alcohol campaign, one of my colleagues and I did a survey of former Soviet servicemen, and we discovered that when they were denied their vodka, they drank antifreeze, they ate shoe polish, you name it. It's been tried, it's failed every other time. And that was during a time, as when I studied in Russia in 1975 and 1976, when if you got a bottle of Czech beer at Christmas time, that was the extent of the stuff that came across the border, unless you were getting it out of the embassy liquor lockers. And some of us did that too. Today, it's coming from everywhere. There is absolutely no limit to what you can get in Moscow. And finally, if those of us who have lived and worked there know very well that if the Russian society is hoping that is thinking that by becoming a little more Islamic on the edges that's going to solve the drinking problem, it's certainly not, because many of Russia's Muslims drink like crazy too. So it ain't going to happen.
Although actually Nick didn't really answer the question about the Muslims, which you actually throw a degree of cold water rather than alcohol on in your book, in terms of some of the more panicked questions about numbers, both from Russian commentators and from the outside. Maybe you might want to talk about the chart you threw up.
It's not, it is not sinister that Rosstat, Goskomstat keeps no official figures on the religious affiliation of its population. It's against the law for the Census Bureau to ask you what your religion is. Here, half the countries in the old EU and old Europe don't keep religious affiliation statistics either. The upshot of this is that there's a whole lot of guesswork going around about the religious background and composition of the Russian Federation population. To me, the most persuasive study on this is one done by a friend and colleague to many of us in this room, Tim Heleniak of the University of Maryland, who very methodically went through the 2002 RF census, the last one that we've gotten our hands on, and looked at the self-identified ethnic groups or nationalities that had traditionally been affiliated with Islamic faith, and counted up all the people who identified themselves that way, and came out with an estimate that we're talking about perhaps 10% of Russia's population then adhering to those groups that had traditional, historic Islamic cultural ties. Now, of course, a big caveat there is that not everyone in these groups now, like the Tatars, for example, the Bakshirs, would call themselves Muslim today. A lot of them wouldn't. Another thing which is also beyond our ken here be the degree of religiosity of anybody who calls themselves Muslim. We know there are an awful lot of people in Western Europe who still call themselves Christian, and some people talk even at Hudson about a post-Christian Europe. Be that all as it may, these numbers do not.
11% in France.
These numbers do not obviously include undocumented illegal immigrants because they can't. But they suggest that while the proportion of Russia's population of traditional, cultural, historical Muslim background may be fairly high, may be comparable to some parts of Western Europe, they're not the sorts of numbers that eminences like V.V. Putin and Henry Kissinger have discussed publicly.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add to that what's important here is not looking at Russia through a Western European lens, because Nick is very rightly emphasizing here historical, cultural Muslim populations. I mean, it's a truism, but it's true, that Islam is the oldest religion in the Russian territory of today's Russian Federation. The Tatars and the populations of the Ural and Volga region converted to Islam before Orthodox Christianity made its mark among the Slavic population. And the Russian government has embraced this. I mean, remember that Russia has observer status in the Organization of Islamic Countries. The Russians are trying to be very careful about this. This is not an immigrant issue here. So the kinds of talk about Eurabia that has become quite the trend in Western Europe has to be very carefully considered if you're trying to think about that in a Russian context. And historically, Russia has been more Muslim proportionately in the past than it is now. If one looks back to the times of the Russian Empire, I mean, Russia is now more, in many respects, Russian, ethnically Russian, than it ever has been at any time before. And previous Russian governments in the Tsarist and other formats have found ways of dealing with this. And I think, there's an adjustment going on in Russian society. There's still a lot of mixed marriages. And there's a quip made about different perspectives on many Russian Muslims on alcohol. I remember Brookings has a big program on the US and the Islamic world, and we have a conference every year in Doha, in Qatar. And several years ago, I brought a delegation of Tatars to the conference. And this is the first time anybody in the Gulf had seen a Tatar, probably, I don't know, probably ever in many respects. It was almost like bringing the first giraffe to London. And there was a whole host of bizarre questions that were peppered at the Tatars. One was asked about how Tatarstan had a different perspective on religion, and one of the Tatars quipped, well, we have Euro, Islam. And one of our Saudi interlocutors, I think he regretted asking it, asked, well, what's that? And he said, it's Islam with red wine. Which didn't go down very well anyway to some of the, obviously he was joking because they were enjoying poking fun at the whole thing, but the whole idea was, they call themselves the Muslims of the Arctic Circle. This is one of the oldest Islamic communities in the world. that developed in a very different environment, and the Tatars have been at the forefront of a lot of Islamic thought, of reformist Islamic thought. They had a huge impact on the Ottoman Empire. There are a series of very good books on this, and in any case, I think Islam is, of course, it's evolving, and there's a lot of outside influences now on Islam inside Russia, but it's not the same debate going on inside Russia as it is in Western Europe.
Let's take 3 more questions. Right here, sir.
The Chechen freelance correspondent, Bethesda Menon. Did migrant out Russian cause brain drain? Thank you.
Rob Warren from the Foreign Service Institute. Nick, thank you for an excellent study. I would like to go a little beyond just the facts and figures. And can you deal into the social economic factors that have led to this crisis? And are there ways to address those?
And one more. Did you have a question, sir? No? Okay. In the middle there.
Hi, Kate Brick with the Migration Policy Institute. I was wondering if you could speak a little more to what you'd mentioned about migration trends into Russia, how they're not sufficient to account for the decrease in population. In many countries where there's an aging population, often you see an increase in migration to take those jobs to care for the elderly, and I was wondering if you anticipate that kind of increase, and if not, if the government plans to do any kind of recruitment campaigns to get people to fill those jobs. Thank you.
Okay. All very good, very interesting questions. Some of them very difficult to answer with facts and figures, at least at hand. We know there's been a Russian Federation exodus of population to places like Israel and to Germany and to the United States. We've got a certain amount of hard data on those exoduses. Some of the, as Fiona mentioned, some of the estimates for other parts of Europe are a little bit more difficult to get, a little bit more problematic. But it is clear that motivated, relatively well-educated men and women from the Russian Federation, not all of whom describe themselves as Russian in ethnicity or nationality, have moved overseas. There have been some pretty positive implications of this exodus for Russia, and one of these concerns remittances of income back to Russia. Russia is one of the top 20 remittance receiving countries in the world today by the estimate of the World Bank and the United Nations and some of the other places that try to pull together these necessarily imperfect calculations. So Russia's brain drain, if you call it that, has not been an unremitting loss from the Russian ledger. It is paying dividends every year, just as international migrations of people who remit money back to their home encourage economic development back in the countries where they lived. It's something very important, I think, to remember about international migrations of working people. Rob, when we talk about the economic and social factors that have led to this crisis, I am way, way, way out of my depth. When I talk to different groups that sometimes ask me why there's been such a drop in birth rates in the modern world, or why there's been such a transformation of family structure patterns in Western Europe and other affluent areas, I say that you would ideally wish to invite not the Nobel laureate in economics, but the Nobel laureate in literature. You want to have the modern day version of the Leo Tolstoy who can explain the zeitgeist and explain the way that trends of thinking are changing and how this affects all of the detailed, important things in the human heart. I'm the Tin Woodsman in that discussion. I will tell you, however, that much of what we see today takes us back to the legacy of Soviet times. These trends did not begin de novo on December 25, 1991, when the big change in government occurred. We probably can guess that many of the perturbations that we've seen have had to do with big shocks and big adjustments that people have had to make in the way that they think about life and about the future and about their families and things like that. The sorts of guarantees and hopes that they can look to, and we have to recognize that a whole lot of people haven't handled the transition with all of its brutal uncertainties very well in the Russian Federation. Now, with respect to migration within Russia, I have a whole nerdy table and chart-filled chapter in here, which will tell as much as I think can be told from torturing the existing data and trying to make them confess. The problem is fundamentally one of observation. It is very hard to count people who are not counted officially and do not want to be detected for various reasons. If we look at existing Russian data, one gets the sense that something like 5+ million people moved into the Russian Federation between '89 and 2002 who hadn't been there in '89 and were still alive in 2002. We'll be able to do that exercise again after the next census. That doesn't count the uncounted, unfortunately. There are people in the Russian government who talk quite sensibly about having a pragmatic immigration policy in which skilled workers from abroad, and especially from the near abroad, can come to help bolster Russia's dwindling labor force, about which Anders and Fiona have both spoken eloquently. There are at least two problems to the prospect of encouraging further immigration to Russia. Actually, let me say three problems. First, to the extent that Russia faces not just one, but maybe in the future recurrent economic shocks, and to the extent that the demand for labor is affected by these shocks, people who wanted to come from abroad will be dislocated and will make them make the prospect of assimilating them more difficult than it was in the past. Second, as far as I can tell, and I'm certainly not the authority to go to on this, but as far as I can tell, the Russian language training skills of the states in the near abroad have been declining, in some cases declining precipitously since the end of the communist era. This will make it more difficult, not more easy, to incorporate, absorb, and assimilate people from the near abroad into Russian society and the Russian economy. And third, and this, this is a little bit more difficult to talk about because, if you listened only to Bill O'Reilly and a few other commentators, you'd have a pretty skewed view of what the American attitude towards immigration might be today. But there seems to be a growing body of public polling data suggesting that the Russian public has become less welcoming, not more welcoming, towards newcomers and foreigners from abroad. And if this is true, if that is true, that will also make the prospect of assimilating the sorts of foreign productive workers that are needed in some economic sense for Russia's future, to assimilate them as loyal and productive new members of the Russian Federation, that will just become more difficult. But you followed this a lot.
There's actually a really interesting dimension to this that picks up on what you just talked about, the backlash there, because as Nick mentioned, there are discrepancies in also in the population decline, and I mentioned in my comments about the North Caucasus. In the Soviet era, there was actually a whole policy of moving surplus labour out of the North Caucasus across the rest of the Russian Federation. And that's still being considered today one of the issues for dealing with the crisis in the North Caucasus. Now, clearly, since all of the wars in Chechnya and the continued crises and insurgency in the North Caucasus, there's not got a great deal of public support for receiving more workers from the North Caucasus, be they Chechen, Ingush, or of any of the multiplicity of ethnic groups there. And also education standards in that region have gone down as well, because that's part of the root of the problems in the region. So Russia, ironically, has internally some other reservoirs of additional labour that are also not likely to be redeployed precisely because of the same kinds of problems. And as Nick has described, and Tim Heleniak and others have described, internal mobility within Russia is pretty much constrained. I mean, a lot of the depopulation that we've seen in some of the areas has been by people literally dying out there and not being replaced by additional births, not simply a matter of people leaving there, although there have been a lot of people trying to leave when they can from Russian regions. But Russia doesn't have U-Haul trucks. They don't have abilities of people to sell their apartments to others, because nobody wants to move to Vorkuta or Magadan from Moscow. So if somebody's trying to buy themselves an apartment in Moscow from one of these places, they're not likely to find a purchaser for their apartment. So there are all kinds of constraints internally within Russia for people to move to where the jobs are likely to be, that add to the difficulties that Nick has described about bringing in migrant workers from outside.
I want to pick up one small point with an anecdote, and it was your question. How do we understand the background of all of this? The answer is we've all got facts and figures. I think the answer is we've all got facts and figures, but we might not actually process them the same way. And this came home to me at the end of the Cold War when I was running Radio Liberty. We were peppering the Russian population with analysis, with statistics, with all the stuff that they might need to form a modern country free of communism. What were our most popular programs at this point in history? It wasn't our economics, it wasn't our labor, it was none of the social sciences. It was our cultural programs. Everything passed through a cultural lens of some kind. So it may be the case that we've all got the same body of evidence, but our analytical prisms are so different that we simply don't understand them the same way. So that gap has to be closed before we can think about how one jumps in to help.
Folks, we're just about at the end of our time. I'd like to take one last question, this gentleman here, and then ask Nick and our discussants to offer any final thoughts.
Will Amatruda. About 3 years ago, there was a program at the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center, which I think adds some perspective to what Dr. Eberstadt said. Blair Rubel, the head of the Kennan Center, commented that there had been significant in-migration from Central Asia into the Russian Federation. And in response to a question from me about what percentage of that were ethnic Russians, who of course no longer being the Herrenvolk in that part of the world might have thought it was good to leave while the leaving was good, and how much of it was indigenous Central Asians, he said that it depends what time period you're looking at, that initially the migration from Central Asia was disproportionately ethnic Russian, but that toward the later period, it was predominantly Central Asian, which would explain both the de-Russification of the near abroad that you mentioned, and also perhaps the increasingly negative view of migration from the near abroad as it becomes less Slavic and more Central Asian.
I think that's a good comment.
Any final wrap-up comments?
No, I just also want to extol again the virtues of the report, and for those of you who haven't read it, as I said, don't be frightened, because it's great charts and tables, and really well written, and very well worth the read, although sobering.
Well, please join me in thanking Nick and our two discussants for terrific.
These are wonderful comments.
And thank you all for coming.